Well, thank you all so much for taking the time to be with us today for this session of Office Hours, where we'll be focusing on data visualization. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, Zuri Group is a full-service consulting agency that works exclusively with nonprofits, from peer-to-peer fundraising, website design and development, digital advertising, and Google Grants account maintenance, to fundraising strategy, systems assessments and selections, full-scale CRM implementations, and everything in between. We are passionate about helping nonprofits use technology to build better relationships with their constituents and maximize their impact. My name is Lo, and I'm a digital marketing consultant here at Zuri Group. If this is your first visit to Office Hours, let's just take a minute to talk about what you can expect over the next hour that we're together. Every month, our senior strategists and developers set aside some time to talk with you about nonprofit technology and provide an opportunity for you to ask questions. We really want for Office Hours to be a space where you can get some free consulting and we can all have an interactive conversation about what's going on in the nonprofit tech space. So we'd love for you to participate by typing your questions and comments directly into the chat. I know sometimes it can be intimidating to speak up, so don't feel like you have to send your message to be viewed by the whole group. You can absolutely send a message to the organizer. That way only I will see it and I can relay that anonymously for you. Our hosts for today are Mike Chichevsky and Brian Harris. And while I am talking to you about them, I'm going to pop up a poll on the screen. We just want to kind of get an idea about how many of you guys are using pie charts in your presentations and your other reporting pieces. So Mike, who on the slide was represented by Hudson, a golden retriever who is a very good boy. Mike is a technical consultant specializing in data reporting and business analysis, and he's also certified as a Tableau Desktop Qualified Associate. Brian Harris is a senior developer here, and he has more than 15 years of experience with Blackbaud software and methodology. He specializes in custom reporting and development. And Mike is going to be reprising some of the session that he led at the inaugural Zuri Group Summit, as well as sharing some new information with us. And Brian's going to be showing us some of the main features and functionality of Tableau and Power BI, and they'll both be taking your questions. Let's go ahead and see what kind of responses we got. Looks like 45% of us are using pie charts and 55% of us are not. Interesting. Okay, Mike, I'm going to go ahead and send you presenter rights, and you can go ahead and get us started.
So I just wanted to ask that little question about pie charts, and I wanted to start off with something just a little fun and different. Because when you work in the world of data visualization, you quickly learn that a lot of people who work in this space absolutely hate pie charts, right? And to a lot of lay people, this is something that's new or something they just don't understand, right? And I said most people in data viz hate pie charts, not everyone. My personal take on it is just that it's a tool just like any other. You can use it or misuse it, but you know, just in general, there's not much you can do with a pie chart that you couldn't do better with a column or a bar chart, you know, so that's just my 2 cents. So in addition to just some of these fun little anecdotes about the world of data viz, we're going to be doing a pretty quick and dirty tour through a lot of the concepts. What is it? Why do we do it? All that kind of stuff. Brian's put together a great bank of some reports to look at in case you all have never seen Tableau or Power BI or anything like that. It's going to be a great intro to how these tools work and what you might expect if you decide to go down that road. And also just some report building basics, because building a data viz report is similar to building, an SSRS report or something like that, but there are places where they diverge. So I'll try to point some of those out as well. And again, it's going to be pretty broad because, there's a lot to cover in the world of data visualization. And I like to break it up into 3 buckets, right? 3 buckets of knowledge that that would be useful to have if you decide to work in this space, right? So the first one is you need to know how to work with data, and you need to know the tool that you're using to build visualizations. And that's pretty obvious, right? So if you're using a Power BI or a Tableau, you need to know how it works. If you're doing something custom in Python or D3, again, you need to know a little bit about that just so you can build what you need to build. The next 2 buckets, most people don't really think about. So the first is design, right? So we're building something that's visual. So it helps to know something about color theory and layout and user experience and that kind of stuff. it also helps to know a little bit about cognition, right? So when we look at a data visualization, how are we processing it, right? How do our brains interpret what's in the visualization? So that's an important piece of the puzzle as well. And we're going to be touching on all three of those things today. So the first thing we're going to talk about is what is data visualization, right? Sort of the starting point. And when you read the white papers and you listen to podcasts, all of the thinkers in this space kind of have their own definition of what data viz is, but there are some similarities. And the first is that it's a communication tool, right? You're trying to communicate something to someone or a group of people. And the second is that you're doing it visually. But I chose this specific definition that's in quotes up on the screen because I really like the last three words, right? To amplify cognition. Because what's the point of taking the time to build something, to put work and effort into this if it doesn't help us do something better, right? So when we create a data visualization, we're creating something called a cognitive artifact. And all an artifact is, it's a tool that helps us think or helps aid or enhance our ability, right? So if we think about, computing numbers, right? Back in the olden school days, we had an abacus. We would use abacuses to help us compute numbers. These days, maybe you pull out a piece of paper and a pencil, right? These are just artifacts that help us think about the problem and help us do better. And when we're looking at a data visualization, a better could mean a lot of different things, right? So maybe the visualization helps you arrive at the conclusion or helps you arrive at a more accurate conclusion. Or maybe it helps you arrive at the conclusion more quickly, right? So that's what I mean by better. And although today's discussion is focused on data visualization, and Brian's going to talk a little bit more about this in depth, we don't want to, we're not trying to say that you need to replace all of your current reporting tools with some sort of visual tool, right? Data visualization is meant to be a complement to some of the things you already do. Maybe you're building SSRS reports, or maybe you're doing stuff in Excel, right? It's meant to complement some of those tools. So Brian, do you want to talk a little bit more about differences between reports and visualizations?
Absolutely. So I've written hundreds of reports in my career, and I would definitely say that the biggest difference between what I think of as a report, and I'm doing air quotes over here, like an SSRS report or a crystal report, or even like a report in Access, those reports are actually, they're designed to display a large amount of detailed data. A lot of times they have like a strict tabular format, or they rely on custom placement of fields. If you think about things like a custom transcript or custom printed envelopes, receipts, acknowledgement letters, all of those require a lot of data, a lot of actual detailed data, and they've got to be placed in very specific places on a page. Or kind of like an Excel spreadsheet, you might have 50 columns full of data. That's not something that's really gonna translate well into a visualization. You want the visualization to pinpoint the information that you're looking for. So on the visualization side, you're looking at something that's going to help you analyze the data, something that's going to make, as Mike said, make that data pop, get your brain to recognize that information right up front. It's normally going to be based on a smaller subset of data, data that you've already filtered and done calculations that you need to look at. And you're really, at least a lot of the things that I've done, you're looking at exploring your results. You're trying to find that answer, as Mike said. You're trying to get to that answer more quickly than you would staring at a spreadsheet of 10,000 rows of data.
That was great, Brian. Thanks a bunch. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is, we're going to continue on talking about why do we visualize data, right? So I'm going to make 2 points here. And the first is we visualize data to get insight into the data set itself. And the other thing we can do is we get insight into the data in the data set, right? It's a subtle point, but when we collect data, right, hopefully we're collecting data with the point that it's data that represents reality or represents some sort of occurrence or phenomenon that happened in reality, right? So we're trying to learn about reality when we visualize the data set. And the second point, we're going to jump into Tableau in just a second here, is summary stats don't always tell the whole story, right? Like you can look at the numbers and it might lead you to one conclusion, whereas if you take the time to plot the data, it takes you to a different place, right? So we're going to jump into Tableau really quick, and I'm going to show you what I mean by that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up a data set. Let me throw it up here. Cool. So we have what we call a, it's tall and narrow, meaning that in this data set, there aren't many columns, but there are a lot of rows and records here, right? And when we look at the rows and records, let me just show you what we have going on. We have an X and Y pair, a Cartesian coordinate, if you remember high school math. And then we have, in the overall data set, we have subsets of data. So we have Dino here. If you scroll down a little bit more, we have away, so on and so forth. And I think there are 12 or 13 subsets in the overall data set. So when we throw this into Tableau, so in Tableau, what I did was I took just the X and Y data that we had, and then I computed a mean. And these are all just calculations I did in Tableau, a Y mean, and then some standard deviations, right? And when you look down the X averages, you can notice they're all pretty much exactly the same. Same with the Y, pretty much the same. Same story for the X standard deviation and the Y standard deviation. So if this is all you looked at, you would say to yourself, there's not a whole lot going on in here, right? This data is all exactly the same. There's not much to see. However, again, the point that I'm making here is when you plot this stuff, something interesting occurs, right? So this is just a plot of all the XY points, but when we start looking at some of those individual subsets of the data, you see visually a very, very, very different story appears. And again, the point is that the X, the Y averages, the standard deviations all appear to be the same, but when you plot them, it's a very different story. And this is my favorite one right here, the dinosaur. I just love that guy. So the takeaway here is that summary stats tell you part of the story. If you want to see the entire picture, though, no pun intended, plot your data, look at it visually, and you might arrive at a different conclusion. The next thing we're going to talk about is how does data visualization work? And this is going to touch on some of that cognitive piece that I mentioned earlier. So the first thing we're going to talk about is attentive processing, right? So attentive processing is performed in your cerebral cortex. It's very slow and deliberate. You'll get to the answer eventually, but again, it's slow and deliberate. So the question I'm going to pose to all of you here is, in this box, this gray box, right, we have a bunch of numbers. So if I asked you to count all the fives, count how many fives there are in here, you'd probably start up here in the upper left, right? You'd start here with a 9, and you would probably just start working your way over. Ooh, there's a 5, there's another 5, so on and so forth, right? So again, you'll get to the answer eventually, but it's very slow and deliberate. The alternative to doing this is to use preattentive processing. So you can take some of this data, you can encode it with something called a preattentive attribute, and no longer do you have to process this information in your cerebral cortex, but it's now done in your visual cortex, and you're going to notice that things are going to jump out at you. So if I go to the next slide, right? So now if I ask you how many 5s there are, you would quickly look at this and you say, oh, there's 6 5s, right? So again, this is called preattentive processing, and it's done subconsciously. You see the 5s jump out at you before you even realize that you've seen it. And this is a very, very important point, right? So a takeaway for y'all here is that if you want to get your audience to pay attention to something, to notice something, before they've even realized they've noticed it, is to encode this in a preattentive attribute. And so in this case, we used color, right? The 5s are in black, everything else is in gray. Some other examples of preattentive attributes: color, we've already seen that one, form, movement, and positioning. And I've got these 5 other little pictures beneath the text, right? And so some of these have direct parallels to chart types, which you may have already seen. So if you look at size, that's just a bubble chart. If you look at line length, we're not talking about anything more complicated than a column or a bar graph, right? So these are all things I'm sure you're familiar with, you just maybe didn't know what they were. And in addition, preattentive attributes don't have to only apply to visual mediums, right? You can use them on text, and I'm sure in your emails all the time, you might highlight something with color, right? Or you might use size to make something look a little more important. And finally, one last example, enclosure. You might not be using this in your emails, but you might see these in print media when you have like a little sidebar with something that's been set off and it's been put in a box. They want you to pay attention to what's inside that box, right? So again, the big takeaway is if you want your audience to pay attention to something, use a pre-attentive attribute and they will notice it before they've even noticed that they've seen it, right? It's a really powerful idea of how you can guide people to look at things and pay attention to stuff. The next thing we're going to talk about, again, we're going to return this idea of what is data visualization, and I'm going to break it up into two pieces, right? So one is the process of visualizing data, and the other is the outcome, because we haven't really looked at many data visualizations yet so far today. Right, so we're going to look at a couple of them just to give you an example of what's possible, right? Not all of them are going to be strictly business relevant, but it'll show you what's possible and what's out there and what you can do. So the first thing we're going to look at is just good old Microsoft Excel, right? I'm sure we've all seen dozens of these throughout our careers. And that's all I'm talking about, just the output of the visualization process. So when I look at this graphic here, right, we're going to start with the y-axis, right? Oh, sorry, the x-axis. And we're going to start with conceptual versus data-driven, right? And it's useful to kind of classify and think about visualizations. So data-driven simply means that there's data underneath the visualization, right? So if we look at that previous example, right, we have profit data underneath this visualization. Conceptual is a little harder for some people to think about. There's no real data underneath the visualization, but think about something like an org chart, right? You may not have rows of data underneath an org chart, but it's certainly visual, and it's certainly communicating like who sits where in an organization. If we look at the other axis, declarative to exploratory, declarative simply means you're stating something, right? So if we go back to the Excel example, we're stating here are the profits for the company, 2013 to 2017. Exploratory is a lot more fun in my opinion. When you build an exploratory data viz, you're looking at trends and outliers and patterns, and you're trying to figure out why something is. So if we think about the Excel example we just looked at, maybe you're trying to explain why the second quarter this year is worse than second quarter last year, right? You're trying to get to the root of why something is. And the output from an exploratory database could very well be another set of questions, right? You root through the data, you just start exploring, and you want to find out more. So you might very well build another database based on what you initially found. And one last thing I want to add here is closely related to exploratory is you might also build data viz for confirmatory purposes, right? Like you might have an idea in your head, a hypothesis, and you go to the data to test your hypothesis to see if it holds true or not, right? So declarative, exploratory, and finally confirmatory. And now we're going to look at a couple of data visualizations, right? So I wanted to start with something that's super tech heavy and super like computer generated, right? Like futuristic. You look at this thing, you're just like, whoa, right? So this is what we call a chord diagram, and it's showing global trade for natural resources for a given year. And I know it looks messy on screen and it might be kind of hard to interpret what's going on, but that's kind of the point. That's what I wanted to show. In that in data viz, we have something called the squint test, right? So if you squint at the screen, can you kind of see what's going on and get an idea of what the message might be? And so for me, we see this big bank of peach over here, right? And that's going to be Europe trading with other European trading partners. If we go a little bit around the circle, we see this large purple one, and that's China, right? China does a lot of trade with a lot of people. And the other thing that jumps out at me, these super thick lines, right? And that's the US trading with its northern and southern neighbors, Mexico and Canada, right? So this is just an example of a super tech heavy data visualization. A lot of technology went into this guy. On the other side, you don't have to have computers to do data visualization. So this is one of my favorite data vizes ever, and it's from the mid 1850s when there was a cholera epidemic occurring in London, right? So a doctor, Dr. John Snow, he just started plotting things onto his map. He just took a map and a pencil and started plotting this. So it's a little grim, I know, but each one of these little marks represents a death, right? And he just plotted all the deaths, and he noticed there was a water pump, which I've highlighted for you. There's this water pump right in the middle of it. So he said to himself, maybe the water pump has something to do with this. And I forget exactly what they did, changed out the pump handle or something, but deaths, dropped. And one other interesting thing about this is, you'll see that there are deaths all along Broad Street, and it seems to jump over the brewery though, right? It skips over the brewery. And the reason is just that the brewers weren't drinking water from the local pump. They were drinking their own product, the beer. And the beer was being drawn with water. It was being brewed with water from a different source. So it wasn't using a contaminated source. So again, the point here is, not all tech, not all data viz has to be super tech heavy. And the last data viz we're going to look at. And I love this one just because the story is so clear. It's so clean and clear to me. And so this is from the Wall Street Journal, right? And you see a lot of great data visualization coming from data journalists these days. It's a really interesting space to pay attention to. But all this one does is it shows you that when the measles vaccine was introduced in 1963, right? So before 1963, you see lots of measles. After, it's quiet, right? So the story is just so clear to me, which is why I love this one. I mentioned before that, in addition to just talking about data viz as an output, we can also talk about the process. So I've got my little homemade graphic here, and we're gonna look at it in 3 different groups. So the first group we're gonna talk about is the question and desired outcome group. Then we're gonna talk about data, and then we're gonna talk about this final third over here. And again, a lot of this does mirror what you might do already with an SSRS report or something similar. So I'm going to really take the time to try to point out where things are different when you're thinking about a visual report. So the first thing, right, question, right? You need to understand what it is you're investigating. What are you trying to answer? And that really helps trim the scope of the project if you can clearly define what it is you're investigating. A desired outcome has really 2 meanings here. The first could be the purely pragmatic or functional meaning of what are we producing, right? What's the outcome? What is the developer creating? And it could be a simple data viz, just a simple single view. It could be an entire dashboard. It could be a scorecard. So that's the outcome. The other one could be a little more philosophical, right? So you see this a lot when you talk about infographics, right? And you're trying to get people to do something. So if, for example, you're trying to, I don't know, save the whales, right? You're creating an infographic with an outcome. So you're trying to get people to know something and or take some sort of future action, right? So you have the pragmatic, what am I building, versus the what do I want people to know or do? And maybe more important than either one of these, which I should have put on here, is just know your audience, right? Knowing your audience is essential. It's crucial for any sort of presentation that you do, right? So in this case, you could look at it as, am I building a report for someone in the C-level suite, in which case they might need rolled up aggregate numbers, or are we building this for someone lower down the chain, which they might need to see those individual rows of data, right? Another way of looking at audience is, who am I building this for? How sophisticated are they? And so if you're building a visualization for someone who's maybe in the healthcare space, they're used to seeing lots of charts. Their chart literacy is fairly high. Or maybe you're building a chart for someone who's a little different, or a different group who's not so used to seeing charts and visual representations. So you might stick with bar charts or something like that for them. Right? So knowing your audience is super duper important. The next piece we're going to talk about is data, right? So we're all familiar with the idea that a report is only as good as the data that's feeding into the report. So you want to make sure your data is good and clean before you start building. And once you've defined who you're building the report for, the questions, all that, you can start building your requirements, you find the data, explore the data, prepare the data for build. And I really want to focus on this data exploration piece here, because when you're building data visualizations, the data that you have sort of defines what you can build, right? So a simple example is if you don't have spatial data, you can't build a map. So you have to get really familiar with the data that you have, and then you can figure out, okay, what can I build with this? So when we think about data and building data visualizations, we think about data attributes, and as well as some of the characteristics of the data. So when we talk about attributes, I'm talking about things like, is it categorical data? Is it ordinal data? Is it quantitative data? Because knowing those 3 things help you define what you can do with it. In addition to that, there's some characteristics, right? So is the data temporal? Like, do you have dates? Can you do some sort of time series analysis with it? Or is the data spatial, right? Like, can you build maps with it? Can you plot this stuff in some sort of geographic way? So again, I can't overstate how important it is to understand the data that you have, and that will help define and trim the possibilities of what you can do with it. And the last piece we have here is just, this is the biggest part that's different, right? It's the actual visual encoding of the data is going to happen in this build report /viz. And then once you do that, you have your usual, send it out to users, they give feedback, you iterate on it and all that stuff, right? So when we think about building the reports in the vizzes, there's some things, again, because this is a visual tool that we're building, that we're going to think about, right? So again, visual design is going to be very, very important. You want to keep it clean, right? More data and clutter does not necessarily translate to more information. And we're going to talk about chart junk in a little bit. Just some usual best practices when you're building dashboards, right? 3 or 4 large vizzes is probably all you're going to get before people start being overloaded. Studies have shown beyond that, they just can't concentrate on any one thing. You want to group and sequence the vizzes in some sort of logical way. So general best practice is to put the most important thing in the upper left, right? And go from there. And that's, the eye is going to be drawn to the upper left generally. It's the first place they look. You can start thinking about things like how frequently people will be looking at these reports, right? So if they're looking at it on a daily basis, you can trim back some of the labeling and some of the explanatory stuff on the dashboard. If they're only looking at this every 30 days, maybe it's a monthly report they look at in a month. You might want to keep that labeling pretty clean and clear, so just so they don't forget when they look at it a month from now what they're exactly looking at, right? So there are a lot of things to think about when you start building dashboards and visual reports that you wouldn't have to normally think about when you're building something different, a more tabular report, right? And we also have some really, if anyone wants, I'm sure we can distribute the slide deck, but there's some great resources out there on like when to choose which kind of charts, right? If you're trying to visualize this type of thing, what chart might be appropriate. So there's some great resources out there, and I'm sure we can provide some of those links. And the last thing I want to talk about here is just chart junk, right? We touched on it briefly in the previous slide, and chart junk is an idea by Edward Tufte, right? So stuff that's on screen that doesn't help you comprehend the info. So here's a simple example, right? So on the left, we have this like silhouette of an apple back there. And on the right, we have the same data, just without that silhouette. And I don't know about y'all, but the one on the right to me is just a lot easier to read, especially the far right columns. It's just difficult for me to tell what's going on here with that bite of the apple going on there. So that's going to get us through that kind of really big high level presentation of what DataViz is. And Brian's going to start talking through some of the more specifics, and he's going to focus on 2 of the leading tools that we have today on the market, Power BI and Tableau. So Brian, I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to you.
Hi, everyone. So what we're looking at here is Power BI and Tableau are 2 of the biggest players in the data viz space. So we get the questions a lot of like, well, which tool should we use? The key things that I wanted to point out are specifically that both of the tools offer a lot of similarities. There's a lot that's going on between the 2 that is great. You've seen Mike do some demos with Tableau, and I'll do some later with Power BI, and you're going to see a lot of those similarities jump out. The big things are that they both offer an extensive option for source data. We're talking anything from Excel spreadsheets, CSV files, text files, JSON files, all the way up to your bigger databases. So you've got MySQL, Oracle, Salesforce, different Amazon databases. So a lot of those are available in both, and you'll see that list grows and grows all the time as Tableau and Power BI get updated. They both have repeatable ETL processes, which we'll look at briefly, but you're going to be able to pull that data in and clean up that data and get it ready for those visualizations, try to get rid of a lot of that extraneous data that's just, it's good for the detail report, it's not good for creating visualizations. And then they both have what I consider to be straightforward report creation. Now, that's not to say that the report creation is always easy, or that getting the specific visualization that you want is easy. But the process itself is not overly complicated. You're going to see in one of my demos later that it can be as easy as dragging and dropping and clicking simple fields. So those are the similarities that they have. Tableau has some pros and cons, just like everything does. And I would say that the biggest pros for Tableau is that, first off, like it says, it is an amazing visualization tool. A lot of that comes from the fact that Tableau is written for visualization. That's what they do. That's what they strive to do in the market. So it's their software. They keep it updated, and they're fighting to stay on top of that market. There's a very active online community, lots of forums, lots of public data sets that you can get into. Again, you'll see those later in the demo. That's where we pulled a lot of the demo data that you're going to see today. And there's a lot of visualization types, and a lot of those are standard. And it can be easier to manipulate a lot of the data formatting, changing your currency signs, making things bold. A lot of that stuff is fairly straightforward. The cons to Tableau, at least currently, appear to be the cost. That seems to be where everyone focuses their attention. Right now, in order to have a Tableau license, an individual Tableau license, I believe the price that I found recently was $70 a month. So for $70 a month, you're going to get the ability to create your Tableau visualizations. You're going to get the ability to share those limited between your teams. There are some cheaper options. There's a $35 option, I believe, and a $12 option, and those are limited in the fact that they're not really made for developers. They're really made for people who are consuming the data. They need to be able to view the visualizations that someone else has developed, but they're not necessarily building those visualizations themselves. So that's something to keep in mind as you're looking into your visualization tools. Is this something that you want to spend a lot of money on up front? Is this something that you have 2 people in-house that need to be able to access and develop a Tableau report, or 40 people that need to be able to go in and create their own visualizations? Power BI, on the other hand, it's a Microsoft product. If you're familiar with Microsoft, then you're gonna be familiar with a lot of Power BI terminology and a lot of Power BI functionality. It's also got Microsoft behind it doing updates and different types of excuse me, troubleshooting service pack. It does allow for quick KPI reporting, so you'll be able to bring in a lot of your data quickly. Drag and drop fields is similar to Tableau. It has a very robust Power Query tool. We're going to look at that a little bit in the demo, of the ability to manipulate the data and write queries. It does come free with a Microsoft 365 license. So you are able to build your own Power BI visualizations as long as you have a Microsoft account. You can download the tool and start building today. You will see in the con section here that we do have some costs associated if you need to publish those Power BI reports to a server, or you need to put them into a group. And there are some Power BI Pro options, which I believe, again, the last total that I found was $10 a month for a Power BI Pro license. And again, you won't need that Pro license to do development, but you will need it to be able to share data across your server for others in your organization. So again, there's less of an upfront cost, especially if you're just trying the tool out and you want to have more than a trial period. But think about that in the long run. Go ahead and jump into some of the demos that I've created, just to show the tools off and to show off a couple of things that I've done, really to just familiarize yourself with things like layout and what you're getting into if you open up Tableau or if you open up Power BI. This in no means is meant to be a training session, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about how to do one thing or another, or why I would do something one way or another. But I just want you to see some of the options that you have and how simple or how complex some of the setup can be. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to my first Tableau project that I've got here. And what we're looking at now is the data source. We're looking at data that I pulled from public record. It's Champion League results. Mike and I, it's no surprise to us, are big football fans or soccer fans, and we recently connected about that recently as our teams were playing against each other. And so this data set's got information for the Champions League, and it's ranging all the way back from 1955 up through, I believe, 2017. And it displays information about the winners, who their opponents were, top scorers, what the scores were, where they played, and what the attendance, and all of that can be seen here. And one of the things that we want to go ahead and note is you have some options on the screen for manipulating data. So for example, winner score, yes, it makes sense that it's an integer value. But if it was something that was related to a cost of something, you can quickly click on the icon here, and you can see that you'd be able to change it to a decimal number. You'd be able to format your dates as date or date time based on what you wanted to have displayed in your visualizations or in your reports. So that's just a quick overview of, this is an Excel spreadsheet. This is the data that we brought in. What you don't see is that I have made some, I've cleaned up this data a little bit in order to make it better for our visualizations. So right off the bat, and I did this one just for Mike, because I know how much he hates pie charts, I wanted to go ahead and throw this pie chart out there and show, in my opinion, why I think pie charts aren't great. And again, not to say that never use them, but they have their place. And what we see here on this visualization is the victories since 1955. And I went ahead and added some annotations of the ones that are important to me. So obviously this big chunk, Real Madrid, 12 wins. Barcelona, Mike's team, 5 wins. And Liverpool, my team, 5 wins. So basically what that's telling us right off the bat is that Mike and I have some work to do. You know, our teams have got to get on the ball to win us some Champions Cups. You can see that if you were to highlight some of these slices, you will get more information. But at a glance, if you had 30 seconds to look at this pie chart, I don't know what those other slices are. And it's really hard to tell, you know, where to go based on that data. So that's one of the things that I'm not a big fan of. The next thing I wanted to show you is how quickly and easily you can build some of these visualizations. Some of them can be really complex, but they don't always have to be. So I'm gonna create a visualization here that shows the number of winners by country. So how many teams have won by the country that they're a part of. And I'm going to count the number of clicks that I have to do to actually build this visualization. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here into my dimension, which if you think about a dimension as a sliceable field, it's data, it's a name, it's a state, it's, you know, that type of information. I'm going to go ahead and bring that up. I'm going to put that in my columns. And we can see here, we've got England, we've got France, we've got Germany. You know, we've got all those different countries that have those winners. Now, the other thing I want to do is I want to get a count of the countries themselves, of those winners. And we've got this winner field here, which if you remember from the data slide, had things like Liverpool and Real Madrid and Barcelona. That really, by itself, doesn't really give us the count that we're after. But what I can do is I can, that's, by the way, one click. And next I'm going to do is I'm going to change this dimension into a measure. So I'm going to click on this drop-down arrow. That's click number 2. And I'm going to convert it to a measure. Click number 3. And you can see what it's done is it's put it down here as a measure for me, and it's automatically put it in as a distinct count. Great, that's exactly what I want. So that was 1 click, 2 click, 3 clicks. Click number 4, I'm going to drag this up into my rows, and boom, automatically it's created a bar chart for me. And we can see right at a glance, England has 5 winners, France has 1. Obviously, if we had more data, you'd see a larger chart, or you might see a more interesting or complex set of information. But in just 4 clicks, less than 5 clicks, we created that bar chart. I didn't have to write any code. I didn't have to do anything special. And then with another click, I can turn that into a filled map, and I can see basically on a globe where everyone's coming from. So I can see the 3 in Italy. I can see the Spain. All that information plotted right here for us. The next sheet that I have here is probably what a lot of you are used to with an Excel spreadsheet or with a tabular report in like an SSRS report. It's just data. It's who's the winning team, what season did they win, who are their top scorers, and what was the goal difference for those years. I'm not going to talk about this slide too much, except we're going to come back to it a little bit later. But I just want you to notice that we do have it grouped by the winner and then by the season. So Ajax here, they've won 4 times, and you can see here the different years that they've won. That's all I'm going to talk about now, but I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide, or the next sheet. And we can see here that I've kind of used that pre-attentive processing that Mike talked about. So this is showing us the average attendance by opponent. We've got the winners down our y-axis. We've got our opponents, our finalists over on the x-axis. And we can see right off the bat that attendance, the higher the attendance, the darker the values are here. So we can see Manchester United has some pretty good attendance. We can see Real Madrid has great attendance and who their opponents were at that time. So if you were an advertiser, or if you were someone who needed to find out, you know, who do you want to win or who do you want to be in the Championship Cup in order to reach the most fans or the most attendance, the most attendees, you'd be able to put this in here and at a glance see right away. It's not that that other data is not here. It's just that we have drawn attention to what we want, those big, large numbers. This is very similar. This is another bar chart. It's looking at the season attendance, and right now we've got it sorted, you know, by the season and then showing the attendance information there. So we've got no surprises. We've looked at some of this information before, but what I wanted to point out on this bar chart is the ability to do things like sort. So for example, you know, right now, yeah, we see that we're all over the place, but what if we wanted to see our large attendances first? we could come up here and with a single click, we could sort and get our information. So we're seeing these large attendances first, breaking down. You can see as I move over the different bars that we have what are called tooltips, like you might see in any other program. And right now the tooltips aren't super helpful. And it does help clean up some of these values that don't have text on the tick marks. But what if we want to get some additional information? We can do that by dragging information straight into our tooltip here. So let's say that we're interested in who the winner was, and I'm going to change this back to a dimension. We're interested in who the winner was, who their opponent was, and let's just say their goal difference. So I've dragged and dropped 3 different fields into this tooltip mark, and now when we hover over the bar, we get a lot more information. So you can see that, again, I didn't have to write any extra code. I just had to tell it where I wanted data to show up. So we got a lot of that information. From those different sheets, we can build dashboards. Dashboards are great, as Mike mentioned, to centralize all your information. And you get that information that you're really interested in the top left, like he was mentioning. We're not seeing anything new here. These are the same sheets that I built. We've just put them together in one dashboard. One of the things that I love about the dashboards is the ability to link those sheets together so that you can filter data on the fly. So for example, we see here this bar chart, or excuse me, this pie chart that we had. If I were to click on Barcelona, all of a sudden we've filtered the detail that we get. So now we're only looking at the 5 Barcelona wins. And I love that. It allows us to go through and quickly look at all these groups on the fly. The other thing I wanted to point out is that if we were to go back to our table, and I was just to change the order of things. So now I want to look at the season and then the winner. So we can see that this is now changed. Instead of getting all the Ajax ones at top, we're now doing in the order of the season. If I go back to my dashboard, my dashboard's changed. So that's just to show you that those link together, and as you're making changes, you don't have to build a new dashboard. A lot of that information is going to carry across. I'm going to jump to another Tableau project that I have, and this one is about climbing statistics on Mount Rainier. And a couple things to point out here. The big difference here on our data sources tab is that we're now pulling data from 2 different data sources. Now, this just happens to be 2 CSV files, but this could be 2 completely different SQL databases. So I've got climbing statistics, which include the date, the route, how many attempted succeeded, and what the percentage was. And then I've got some weather statistics for those same dates. So the date, and then things like temperature, relative humidity, wind speeds, all that information is displayed on the same screen. And then you can see here that I've joined by the date. So I'm linking 2 data sets together simply by putting them into my data sets and changing what the join is. And this line chart that I've created allows you to look at a couple different attributes at the same time, or a couple different measures at the same time, so to speak. What we're looking at here is the climbing success rates based on the temperature and speed. So as we go across, we have weekly breakdowns, and then we have how many have succeeded during that week. And what I've done is I've put in those measures, and I've got the average temperature, so ranging in color from blue to red, blue being cold, red being hot, and then average wind speed. And that's going to be shown in the width of the line. You might be looking at this data, exploring, trying to decide when you're going to make your trip to Mount Rainier to do your climb. And you can try to make a correlation, or you might be able to see a correlation between the temperature and the success rate. Maybe it's easier to climb when it's hot outside, or maybe the wind speeds are less at the beginning of the summer versus the end of the summer. And you can make decisions based on that information. Another tabular value here that I've created, it's based on route. So we're looking at the route, how many attempted, how many succeeded, and the percent success rate. A lot of the information here is straightforward. This, again, is something you might see in a spreadsheet. It's something you might see in a SSRS report. But I've created a dashboard that combines the 2. And just like we saw with that pie chart in the previous project, this route now becomes a filter for my chart. So if I'm interested in, let's pick one of these large ones, disappointment cleaver, that's the one I'm going after this year. I can click on disappointment cleaver and get just the line related to that specific route. And I might be able to see it's like no one attempts it prior to February. Okay, that's something I should know. Or no one has succeeded last year prior to April. I want to take that information into account and make some smart decisions about when I'm going to climb, which for me will be never. So now I'm going to jump over to Power BI, and we're going to see similar experiences, and then we're going to take a look at a couple different options. So the first thing I'm showing here in Power BI is the Power Query Editor. Very similar to that data source tab that we saw in Tableau, this query source editor allows us to go in and manipulate data. So we can see here, I'm looking at Airbnbs in New York City. That's, again, just the public data set that I pulled. So we've got information here about the neighborhood group, which is kind of the borough. We've got the neighborhood itself. We already have, or we were given latitude and longitude, which is great. That's going to come in handy. You'll see for maps, the type of room, price information. What I really want to show on the Power Query Editor is over on the right-hand side. You see this applied step section. It's a great section. Really, it allows me to go back and see everything that I've done to this data set. And sometimes I can undo it, or sometimes I can duplicate it. So if I go all the way back up to source, we can see that my source data had these ID columns, which the ID columns might have been great if I was joining to a different data set, or if I was trying to go back into my database and find more information about records. But for my visualizations, I don't really need it. So things like ID and host ID and the host name, those really weren't important to me. So we can see there was a couple of different things done with headers. And then right here, I removed columns. And after I removed those columns, those IDs and names completely disappeared. And you can see there were some errors. And basically that comes from some of these fields didn't have values. So I removed those errors. And we can see, we can track those steps all the way from start to finish and backtrack if need be. So that was the main thing I wanted to show, the difference kind of between the Power Editor and that data source tab. They're both super powerful, and being able to go in and look at your source data versus what you're actually feeding into the visualizations is great. So I'll close out of that Power Query Editor now. And we'll look at my first worksheet in Power BI. As I mentioned, the fields on the right-hand side, the different types of visualizations available to us, filters, and then our map and our bar chart. Similar to what we did in Tableau, these two visualizations can be linked together. So right now I'm looking at every Airbnb, and I believe this data set has somewhere in the tens of thousands of Airbnbs listed. But let's say that I'm going to make a trip to New York, and I know that I'm going to stay in Dumbo, which I just thought was funny just by the name, but I'm going to stay in Dumbo. I can click on that, and boom, the map automatically zooms in. It shows me that Dumbo neighborhood, that Dumbo district, and now I can see smaller sections of, what was the price? What was the room type? Right now, I have the room type filtered to entire homes because I don't want to share a room with someone. But, those would be showing up here. And similar to Tableau, we'd be able to edit this tooltip to show more information. So you might have, when you hover over one of these records, you might have an address or a phone number to call. You may want to get the name of the person who's actually running the Airbnb. All the information you might need at your fingertips for setting up a reservation. Another bar chart and more tables. This one is filtered by Staten Island. So we're looking at just records on Staten Island, and again, still looking at entire homes. But these are all the neighborhoods within Staten Island. I can look at this average price and say, well, I'm not going to pay $800 a night for my Airbnb, but maybe I want to stay somewhere where it's $100 a night. So now I can click on that neighborhood, and right here, I've gone ahead and limited my records by just the 2 Airbnbs that are in Hallam Hook. And again, we could have more information here. I just wanted to put some basic information to show how you can filter it. The other thing that I wanted to show in this project is one of the tools that Power BI has where you can have custom visualizations. It's something that Power BI has that I believe, and Mike can correct me if I'm wrong, that Tableau doesn't currently have. But you do have the ability to create custom visualizations or import custom visualizations that other organizations and individuals have created. And I've done one that I think is horrible, and it doesn't actually show data in a way that would be meaningful. And Mike would cringe when he sees it because it has that chart junk that he talked about, and that's this fish tank. This is a custom visualization that I found that allows you to see a fish tank and change the shape of fish and based on data that you've got. So right here, I've got sharks as the number of Airbnbs within a specific neighborhood. So 20,000 in Brooklyn. And then these circles, I've got the count of the room types, which again, those two metrics don't really make much sense to show together because they're going to be the same for each neighborhood. But you can see how I've got circle fish and I've got shark fish, but I've also got all this grass and this rock. And while it might be pretty and cute, it's not something that you're probably going to get a lot of use out of if you need to see data up close. And definitely, if you want to see this little fish down here, it's so small and it's the wrong color, there's no reason that you would even notice that at first glance. So that's just to show you that there are custom visualizations in Power BI. You may or may not want to use them, but it's always something that you can look into for downloading. And the last Power BI example that I wanted to show is related to restaurant data. So this restaurant data is pulling in, I believe it's restaurants and other establishments, but I've limited it to New York and New York City just to kind of go with the theme that we've had up until this point. And what we can see is this table that I've created that's showing the state and the city, the address, and what that establishment does. We've got this pie chart. Again, I just wanted to reiterate how unhelpful this is when you get such small slices that you can't even tell what they are. You've got a slicer here that allows you to change the filters within your dashboard. So you've got New York, New York City, but I could also do Oregon or South Carolina. And then we've got our map. So nothing new as far as the type of visualizations, but they are all linked together. So if I was to come in here and say, I'm interested in restaurants, well, there we go. Now we've got a smaller subset in our table, and I can zoom in here on our map, and we can see the different restaurants. And again, we can change those tooltips, but here we've got Ruby, Asian Fusion, and Sushi Bar. It's got an address, maybe want to put a phone number. So all that information is there. One of the things that I really thought is important about Power BI that I think everyone should be aware of is the ability to ask a question of your data. I ask questions all the time, and it's hard sometimes to write code in order to get what you want. Power BI has this ask a question option. So if I click ask a question, you'll see it brings up a blank table, and it tells me to ask a question of my data. So I can ask in English real world questions about my data. So I might want to say, which places are in Oregon? There we go. So now I'm only getting the list of places, which is our businesses, in the state of Oregon. And it knows that information because it's gone through and it's read my data. Maybe I want to say, you know, what is the top and max menu item? Well, here we go. We've got a bunch. Looks like they're $312. I don't know what's on this pizza. There's no way I'm buying it. But it's gone through the data and it's found the top items. And you can even say, you know, what's the top 3 top and max items? And there you go. It changes the bar chart for us to give us the top 3. Now, my data is not sorted well. That's why those numbers don't seem to match what they had before. You can say, what's the average top end by place? So here we go. Eddie's Italian Restaurant. The average top end price on their menu items, $163. He's probably got those really expensive pizzas. Same thing, California Pizza Kitchen. You know, they have an average top end of $67. And then we get down to some of these other places. But you can see here how typing a real world English sentence has given me data. I didn't have to drag and drop fields. I didn't have to build a chart. I didn't have to know really anything other than what's in my data set. So I knew that place was how I named my restaurants. I knew that top end was the max menu item price. And all the information was built for me. Now, one of the things that I mentioned in the cons section of Power BI is the fact that in order to publish these reports out to a group or to share them on a large scale, you do have to publish them and they do have to go out through a Power BI server. So you'll see there's a publish button up here, and that would publish it to my Power BI server. And I'm just going to go ahead and jump out to my Power BI server real fast. And you would see something like this. So a developer logs in, they might see the dashboards they've created, the reports they've created. And all these are going to look really similar. If I were to click on my restaurants reports, here we go. We see the same visualization that I just created in Power BI Desktop, but now it's on my server. I'm going to go back. And the last thing that I really wanted to jump into here is something called quick insights or insights. And that's something that Power BI offers. So I've got my different data sets here. I can say this location and average price. This was my Airbnb data set. Click on the ellipses and I choose view insights. And it's going to do some processing on the back end. I've already pre-done it just to speed it up, but I want to say it took less than 30 seconds to generate these. And what it does is it evaluates your data and it tries to come up with trends and interesting information that you might be interested in. I find that a lot of these insights aren't super helpful, but that's because I'm using data sets that aren't necessarily real world related. and they're not necessarily as clean as I would want them to be. But you might be able to go through these insights that, again, I didn't have to create. The system created them for me. And you might be able to make some decisions about, your data, or you might see a visualization that you haven't used before that really shows good information. So just right off the bat, average price by room type. Hey, again, I didn't create it, but I know that the average price for an entire room rental for an Airbnb is $211. In Greenwich Village, I know that the minimum night stay for shared rooms is a lot higher than it is anywhere else. That's something that I might not have noticed, or I might not have looked at. I might want to know what these outliers are in these charts. So again, you may not find the most helpful information in these insights, but it's a lot of information that you didn't have to create. And again, it may give you some look into your data that you weren't aware of. It'll point out those outliers. It'll point out, why do you have more people in Pennsylvania than you do any other state? Those are the type of things that you would expect to see from those insights.
So this is a dashboard for an educational organization. The organization is housed in the Northeast, right? And the story we're going to tell ourselves is it's a dashboard for a middle manager type person. So he or she can compare where the organization is this month versus the same month previous year. So the first thing we have, just a couple of filters in the upper right. Date filter, donor type, so that's just going to be individual versus organization, and whether or not it's the first time someone donated. Maybe if it's the first time they've donated, you want to put them in a separate email check to thank them and welcome them and do all those sorts of good things, donor outreach. We have a KPI block here so we can see quickly where we are this month versus same month last year. A quick map with where the dollars are coming from. And then we have a couple of other views down here. And again, it's important to not overload the viewer with too many views because they can quickly become overwhelmed. So you want to make sure you've defined what it is you're trying to investigate and you build focused views to specifically address what you're trying to investigate. So over here, we just have a quick who donated. So it's just going to be the name, the dollar amount, and also account, right? So over here, we see Novellus Systems has made 2 donations this month. And we also have this broken down by alum versus non-alum. And again, this is an educational organization, so it might matter to them, hey, we care about if former students are donating to us, and you might want to give those people special attention, thanking them for that. The other thing we have here is just a quick fundraising dollars by constituency groups with little bars and also just an overall total. So there's a lot of interactivity baked into this, right? So if we hit dates, right, and obviously it's going to filter. It shows information for the specific month that we've chosen. We can also choose individuals versus organizations, right? So if we care about that distinction, all that information is available here. And again, first time donor is just a yes, no, so we can specifically drill down to that information. We can also drill down specifically to a state, right? And drill into things that way. And one of my favorite features in Tableau is the ability to embed a view into a tooltip, right? So if I hover over this, Caleb Bourne, I can see all of Caleb's gifts, his lifetime giving. It's all right there for me to see. So you get a quick picture of what he or she has done in the past. So this is just a quick demonstration of a dashboard, and the last thing I want to point out is just that you can also link things from dashboards back into BBCRM. Right, so if we go to Simone Work's name here, I'm going to click on Simone. It's going to pull up a Simone's constituent page. And again, that's just a quick URL action. If you were building a dashboard for a different purpose with different information, let's say you were looking at opportunities, right, you can link back to the opportunity page. And you can take the dashboard and really embed it and pull useful information out of BBCRM and sort of guide people to what they need to find.
As you guys can tell, this is a huge topic that we are super passionate about and that we could definitely spend a whole other office hours on. So I know we're We're over time, so I'm going to go ahead and let us end it here today. If you do have questions, we would absolutely love to take them, and we're happy to follow up with you via email. So please go ahead and send those in to officehours@zurigroup.com. Both Mike and Brian have offered to follow up with people and get any questions that you might have that you wanted to ask. And Mike and Brian, I just want to thank you both for hosting this session. It was really informative and really interesting, and really great to be able to see the different functionalities of those tools and see what's possible. And I also want to thank all of you who took the time to be with us today. Next month's office hours is going to be all about budgets. Chris Cannon, Andrew Urban, and Carly Samuelson will be leading that discussion. But we'd also love to do something a little bit different this time and have one of you guys join in on the conversation. So if you are interested in being a panelist, please go ahead and email officehours@zurigroup.com so that we can discuss that a little bit more. And we will see you next month. Thanks again, everyone.